I'm intrigued that this was the method that you chose. I guess when I was first exposed to that idea of taking a large volume of newspaper clippings or accounts from 18th century, 19th century, it just seemed such an interesting angle of view, and then to try to do quantitative analysis, but also I think content analysis. I reread the paper that you had shared with me a couple months ago, the mechanism paper. Mm-hmm. And I think it's in there where there's a description of all the verbs and the compression of the verbs and so forth. It was just so fascinating to me. It's something I've been aware of that sort of methodology of taking narrative language and then turning it into kind of an analysis of events, what was happening, who were the agents, what was done to, and which of these verbs are more aggressive verbs and which are more accommodating verbs. That whole approach is so fascinating to me, and I'm kind of wondering where it came from. You were saying that you were at least influenced by Chuck's use of it. Were there other social scientists, social historians making use of technologies or approaches like that?
Yes, another younger scholar who was also influenced by Chuck and who I met at the University of Michigan was an Italian called Roberto Franzosi. Franzosi, in fact, has a book which is called From Words to Numbers, in which he has gone even further than Tilly or myself have in this methodology. One of the reasons it was so slow in coming, and I think it has now become an established social science methodology, one of the reasons it was so slow in coming was the fascination that social scientists developed when they first realized that coded information could be put into the computer and analyzed with sophisticated statistical programs. It was also the development of these statistical programs themselves which made this possible, because it didn't require you to be a programmer. You could have a minimal exposure to elementary statistics and learn how to use social science programs and plug in, for example, any election or any series of elections and come up with multivariate analysis without going very deeply into the data in any particular country or any particular election. It was very slow in coming, and it awaited the development of the tools of machine-readable text analysis, which began to develop about the time I was writing Democracy and Disorder, and which has since become far more highly developed and far more skillful in its use. There are now social scientists who can scan entire newspaper articles, and the computer program will read those articles and code each sentence in terms of who the subject is, what the verb is, what the object is. There are difficulties, and there are false positives, as I discovered when I wrote some work on the European Union with my friend Doug Imig in the late 1990s. It is possible to come up with results which are absolutely absurd because the computer isn't very smart. One wonderful example that Doug and I found was that we discovered what appeared to be a large number of strikes occurring in hospitals. And we said, why would there be so many strikes in hospitals? Well, our machine-readable data was producing a large number of hospitals as objects and a large number of stories about labor. The computer read this as if there were strikes going on in hospitals. In actual fact, these weren't protests at all. These were women giving birth. And unless you looked at the actual stories from which that correlation came, you might have thought hospitals were hotbeds of industrial conflict. So there were problems, and it led Imig and I to be rather prudent about the extent to which we were willing to use machine-readable text analyses. But in the near decade since then, there are other social scientists who've gone much further, and the development of text reading programs has become far more sophisticated than they were.
Interesting. I want to flash forward
Sure.
a decade or so and turn to the Dynamics of Contention book, which I think is just really a path-breaking, really important book. You would probably say it's also continuous with other work that you had been doing and Chuck had been doing, and I'm sure
In part,
that's true.
right.
But one of the things I take out of it, well, first of all, is the causal mechanism approach, which I think is such a positive replacement for the idea of looking for generalized laws of social contention. And then the other is the recognition of contingency. Once you take the mechanisms approach, you also, and you three authors emphasize that they concatenate in different ways and lead to different outcomes. And so there's a tremendous amount of contingency and variation, which doesn't make it incomprehensible, but it makes it, which you should never expect the kind of positivist, naturalistic, if social phenomena are orderly, then they should flow according to some very simple laws. Mm-hmm. And the Dynamics of Contention book, I think, does just a great job of refuting that perspective. So I just wonder if you would talk a little bit about the mechanisms approach.
Well, thank you. I wish all social movement scholars were as enthusiastic about the book as you are, but as you may know, it's a very controversial book, and it has been deeply criticized by a lot of our colleagues and friends in the social movement, fraternity and sorority. Let me just say something about how I got there. Tilly and McAdam had different routes of arriving at a focus on mechanisms and processes. In my case, it goes back to my first book. And it goes back, as many things do in careers, to a fundamental error I made in my first book. I just published this article in European Political Science, which I'll give you a copy of, called Confessions of a Recovering Structuralist. And I think you'll enjoy it because it tells how I was speaking mechanisms even then and didn't know it. When I was studying the varying fates of the Communist Party in northern and southern Italy in the 1960s, I was embedded, as many of my peers were at the time, in a very structuralist epistemology. I was trying to find ways in which the structural differences between North and South Italy produced the varying levels of success of the Communist Party in North and South. It was a highly structuralist approach in which the assumption was that a certain level of industrial and economic growth produced left-wing party success in the North. The absence of that structure and the presence of a backward agrarian structure produced a very modest level of success for the same party in the same country. The entire time I was carrying out that analysis, I was seeing, but not understanding, the degree of strategic contingency that was combining with the structural preconditions to produce those outcomes. I knew, as all students of Italy at the time did, that the Communist Party had come up with a strategy that was not a traditional Stalinist or Leninist strategy. On the contrary, Togliatti, who was the leader of the party at the time, came back from Moscow with a theory of producing a new form of Communist Party, a Communist Party that would be present within the trenches and fortifications of Italian society. The term is Gramsci's, but Togliatti picked it up. And so the idea was a parliamentary route to socialism. Now, if you're going to follow a parliamentary route to socialism, it follows that you're going to need to try and gain a majority of the votes. Well, it didn't take long before the communists understood that they couldn't do that wholly basing themselves on the support of the organized working class. It was in part because there was a large middle class, but it was also because there was a relatively large peasantry in the country, and particularly in the South, where the working class was a small minority, they would have to make alliances.